If you grew up in the United States over the last half century, this image is likely burned into your collective consciousness. We are taught in grade school that Native Americans were peaceful stewards of the land, innocent victims who were forcibly removed by European colonizers. This chart shows recent polling from the Manhattan Institute, measuring exactly what students are absorbing in the classroom today. According to the data, 45% of high school students are taught explicitly that America was built entirely on stolen land. That curriculum did not emerge from a sudden breakthrough in archaeological evidence. It was mainstreamed by professional political activists who descended on Washington, D.C. in the early 1970s. Protesters occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building and barricaded themselves inside. They fashioned makeshift weapons, declared war on the United States, and leveraged the ensuing standoff to force the Nixon administration into handing over land and sweeping policy concessions. Through sheer political pressure, the narrative of the peaceful, environmentally harmonious Native American became institutional policy. But a review of the physical, archaeological record reveals a distinctly different frontier. This modern narrative of the frontier prioritizes political utility over archival depth. To understand why the record looks so different from the textbook, we must look past the 1970s and into the soil of the continent itself. This chart shows the frequency of conflict among known human societies throughout history. It reveals that somewhere between 90 to 95% of primitive societies engaged in constant active warfare, compared to about 40% of modern civilized states. We know this physical reality applied directly to the Americas long before Columbus set sail. At an excavation site in South Dakota, known as Crow Creek, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave containing more than 500 men, women, and children who were slaughtered, scalped, and mutilated in the mid-1300s. The violence was severe and highly ritualized. Tribes from the Great Plains to California participated in ancient traditions meant to humiliate and cripple enemies in the afterlife. Captives were subjected to slow execution, and evidence of cannibalism, including processing bones for marrow and eating the hearts of fallen enemies, has been documented at dozens of pre-Columbian sites. This violence was almost always driven by disputes over resources. Far from lacking a concept of property rights, tribes fiercely defended defined territories, hunting grounds, and agricultural plots. They routinely massacred rival bands who poached on their land. Before Europeans ever set foot in the Americas, the continent was already a landscape defined by total war and violent territorial conquest. When European powers did push westward, they did not effortlessly steamroll the native population with advanced weaponry. In many early conflicts, European technology was an active disadvantage. The Spanish and early Americans relied on heavy, single-shot muskets that had to be loaded from the ground and were prone to failing entirely in damp weather. A Plains Indian on horseback could fire 30 arrows accurately in the time it took a soldier to reload once. Highly mobile tribes like the Comanche used their mastery of horsemanship to launch devastating surprise attacks. They outmaneuvered, ambushed, and destroyed columns of Spanish, Mexican, and United States military forces for over a century. It took 300 years for European colonists to match the firing rate of a native archer on horseback. That parity only arrived when Samuel Colt introduced the first production repeating revolver in the 1830s. For centuries, Native American forces held a distinct tactical advantage, turning the slow, rigid military formations and cumbersome technology into a fatal liability. The story of the West wasn't won through biological warfare either. The oft-repeated claim that colonizers wiped out tribes by distributing smallpox-infected blankets traces back to a single failed proposal at Fort Pitt in 1763. A plan that collapsed because the virus rarely spreads on surfaces, and the targeted Indians were already exposed to a regional outbreak. The real tactical shift in the frontier wars occurred when military leaders like General William Tecumseh Sherman realized that conventional, rules-based warfare was entirely useless against the Plains Indians. The U.S. Army abandoned traditional tactics and began fighting exactly like the native tribes. They launched surprise night raids, aggressively pursued bands through the winter, burned encampments, and starved entire tribes by decimating the great bison herds. This embrace of total war was backed by the vast industrial capacity of the United States. The Army leveraged a booming national economy, mass production of weapons, and expansive railroad networks to simply outlast native forces. Ultimately, the American conquest of the West relied on the U.S. Army's ability to mirror the relentless, total war methods of the tribes they faced. The United States military did commit horrific, unprovoked atrocities during these campaigns. In instances like the Sand Creek Massacre, volunteer soldiers attacked a peaceful encampment, indiscriminately killing and mutilating hundreds of women, children, and elders. Such slaughters generated intense public outrage and congressional investigations, separating them from the historical norms of the continent. In traditional intertribal warfare, defeated enemies were entirely exterminated, the survivors enslaved, and the captured warriors tortured to death over a matter of days. When the U.S. government finally secured a victory, the resulting policy diverged from these tribal precedents. Instead of total erasure, they granted millions of acres of designated reservation land to the very tribes they had just fought. No single life illustrates this complex aftermath quite like the final chief of the Comanches, Quanah Parker. Parker spent his youth leading brutal raids against white settlements, killing pioneers and terrorizing the Texas frontier. Yet when the Comanche were finally subdued, he was never put on trial, imprisoned, or executed for his actions. He relocated to a massive tract of highly valuable cattle land in Oklahoma. Parker amassed personal wealth, moved into a 10-room mansion, lobbied lawmakers in Washington, and rode in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade. History is rarely a clean morality play, populated by pure victims and flawless heroes. When we replace the harsh realities of the American frontier with a simplified story of victimhood, we lose our ability to understand exactly what it took to build the modern world.